Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another of Sussex Wildlife Trust's evening webinar series. I'm hosting tonight. My name is Sarah Ward and I'm Living Seas Officer at Sussex Wildlife Trust, and I'm really pleased to welcome Katie, Searles and Sherece Thompson, who are here representing the Chasm project, which, as I'm sure you know, is Crustaceans, Habitat and Sediment Movement. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. I'm sure many of you will have already attended our webinars in the past, but for anybody that hasn't, we're hosting this as a webinar, so you won't be able to participate or raise your hand at all, but what we have is a Q&A function, which you'll find probably at the bottom of your screen. If you want to raise a question, then we will have a Q&A session at the end. So please do feel free to pop your question into the Q&A function, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. There's quite a number of participants tonight. I can see there's already over 100 of you, which is really fantastic. So if there's lots and lots of questions, we may only have time for a handful, but hopefully if there's loads of questions that have gone unanswered, then our hosts tonight will be able to answer those directly after the webinar's finished. We're going to be recording the webinar tonight, so if you do end up having to leave early or want to watch it back, it will be available to watch on our website or on our YouTube channel, hopefully within the next couple of days. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Sherece and Katie. So over to you guys.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Oh, looks like we're speeding through tonight. Yes, so welcome to our presentation about Chasm, the project looking into crustacean habitat and sediment movement.
Sherece, I think you might have froze there. Are you still there? Okay, well, I will carry on if Sherece is on mute. So hi everyone, I am Katie. I was an intern coastal process scientist with Channel Coast Observatory between 2020 and 2021. So I was working with Dr. Charlie Thompson, and my role on the Chasm project was to be an intern student researcher.
Hi, hope you can all hear me now. I'm the Coast Explorer intern with Kent Wildlife Trust Consultancy Services, and I started working on Chasm in May 2021, and it's just coming to an end now in November. Next, we'd like to introduce you all to the research area. In blue on this map shows the wider research area focused on in Chasm. The yellow indicates Selsey fishing grounds. For those that do not know the Sussex area, Selsey Bill is right on the peninsula, surrounded by Selsey Bill and the Hounds Marine Conservation Zone. There is also the Pagham Harbour Marine Conservation Zone, which lies to the east of Selsey, and Utopia Marine Conservation Zone, which is to the south of Selsey. Bracklesham Bay is a site of special scientific interest in the research area and is located to the west of Selsey. So the Selsey Bill and the Hounds Marine Conservation Zone was designated in 2019 for its high diversity and geological features, namely the Hounds, which is an area of limestone and clay exposures just offshore from the tip of Selsey. The Hounds represents a rock system which spreads across the whole of the Marine Conservation Zone. In addition to this, the Marine Conservation Zone houses one of the best examples of peat and clay exposure on the southeast coast, which is known as the Mixon Hole. This has been deemed a marine site of nature conservation importance by West Sussex County Council. And lastly, the site is home to the very rare short-snouted seahorse. Pagham Harbour is a designated site of special scientific interest, Ramsar site, special protection area, and marine conservation zone. The Marine Conservation Zone was designated in 2013. Parts of Pagham Harbour support the rare lagoon sand shrimp, as you can see on screen, and Defolin's lagoon snail, both of which species are highly vulnerable to disturbance. Important habitats at Pagham include the seagrass beds, intertidal mudflats, salt marshes, and brackish marsh reed beds. The Bracklesham Bay site of special scientific interest also has reed beds and salt marshes. It is known for its amazing Eocene fossil beds, which have revealed over 160 different species of fish, amongst other things. So, apart from its geological importance, rare species, and equally important habitats, Selsey has a fishing industry which is steeped in history. The Selsey fishing industry is over 1,000 years old. It lays claim to the earliest recorded event of fishing in the country, dating back to the Venerable Bede's writings in 700 AD, which describes St. Wilfrid and his monks teaching the Selsey locals to fish for eels with nets. Unfortunately, the area has been suffering declines.
Have you frozen again, Sherece? Are you there?
The last 10 years than they had in the previous 100. So, Chasm has been underway since January 2020 and is a legacy to previous projects such as Seize the Day, which highlighted the concerns about the fishing industry in Selsey. The reports on the declining crustaceans coming firsthand from the fishing community. Crab and lobster are the main catch of the area, especially in summer months. Along with reported declining crab and lobster, there was concern surrounding build-up of sediment in the areas of Selsey, which had now made previous fishing grounds unfishable. These reports are what led to the creation of Chasm, the Crustacean Habitat and Sediment Movement Project. Chasm was originally started by Chichester District Council, Channel Coast Observatory, and the University of Brighton, but has since grown substantially to include all of the following partners. Over the past year since the project began, the following aims have been looked into more closely. Firstly, trying to understand the environmental, physical, and climatological changes that have taken place in the Selsey Bill fishing grounds, with particular interest in the Selsey and the Hounds Marine Conservation Zone. Sediment increase, sediment sources, sewage. Oh, sorry, skipping ahead. Secondly, trying to determine whether the fishing grounds have been impacted by recent environmental inputs, including sediment increase, sediment sources, we're going to look more closely at what's been done to date.
Sorry, just quickly, Sherece, I think you froze there. I'm not sure for everybody else. So if you mind going over the second aim again?
Oh yes, sorry.
That's all right.
So secondly, trying to determine whether the fishing grounds have been impacted by recent environmental inputs, including sediment increase, sediment sources, sewage discharge, and contaminants in land runoff. Is that okay?
Awesome. Yeah, sorry, you just froze out there, so I thought I'd...
No, that's fine. Thank you.
So under the first aim, which, as Sherece has just explained, was understood to be the environmental, physical, and climatological changes that have taken place, a timeline has been created based on any data we have on this information. Now, this is just a representation of a timeline that was created in the first year of research, and it shows the observed changes and the key events in the area in order to determine a local change narrative. So from weed species declining in 2005 to the Mesmery Realignment Scheme, which Sherece will touch on in a minute as well, right to 2020, where sedimentation stops, the use of the Puller Bank fishing ground. And again, these are observations from some of the fishermen, as well as data that we have from various sites.
The Mesmery Realignment Scheme. So what was it? It was an Environment Agency project which set about to breach the first line of defence at Mesmery. That first line of defence was a 3-kilometre shingle bank built in the 1960s to stop the sea flooding the land and to promote farming on land. The shingle bank had been continuously breached naturally in the past and caused much damage. In addition to keeping up the maintenance of the shingle bank was costly and not viable in the long term. By purposefully breaching the shingle bank, the seawater was able to flood the land and create habitat for many coastal and wetland species. The newly created mudflats and salt marshes store water, therefore slowing down erosion and reducing the risk of flooding in the surrounding area. In order to understand change in the area, we first need a baseline to compare to. One of the things we wanted to look into was the size of sediment particles and how they were distributed in the research area. By having the sediment particle sizes, we would be able to create a baseline of the sediment types present. And then this would aid us in establishing sediment change. So looking at where sediment was moved shallow and deep water. And what you're seeing on screen is an approximation of several sample sites. The sample areas were chosen to best represent a baseline for change. They are around key areas of interest like the NAB Tower or the A1 Submarine Wreck, but also because logistically they were accessible. The samples were analysed in the University of Southampton Sediment Analysis Lab. So the NAB Tower, which I just referred to, was originally put in place to act as part of a defence system in the First World War. It was to be part of a network of towers which would have some type of steel netting attached to them to prevent German U-boats entering the Solent. That actually never happened, and so the NAB Tower, the only tower fully built, was instead put into the sea and utilised as a lighthouse. The last lighthouse keeper left the NAB in the 80s when it became fully automated. Its relevance in the Chasm project is linked to the fact that it is now a licensed disposal site for dredged materials such as sand and silt. Here we have the A1 Submarine Wreck, and this sunk in the Eastern Solent in 1911. The A1 Submarine Wreck is an important area for sediment deposition, and we had sediment samples from here dating back to 2009. As we're highlighting some important features within the research area, here may be a good place to mention that we have fresh water entering the system from Chichester Harbour, Mesmery, and Langstone Harbour. There is also suspected freshwater underground springs in Bracklesham Bay. From this satellite photo, you can see where the fresh water entering from Langston and Chichester can cause sediment plumes.
So as Sherece has already mentioned, we have formed a baseline of sediment particle size distribution analysis to help us with our first aim of understanding environmental changes in the area. So from this map, you can see from the yellow percentage, you can see that in the outer Mulberry is mainly sand, and then you've got the brown to represent the mud, and then the grey to represent the gravel, which were the three main particle sizes analysed in the assessment. You can also see in Mixon Rocks, just to the south of the peninsula, that is mainly mud. And then you've got Bracklesham Bay and Mesmery Bank, which are also mainly sand. So you can also see on the left, there was analysis of the A1 submarine site, which Sherece also mentioned is of significance to the project. And this was more of a mixed and varied result. So as part of the research in the first year of study, we also looked at topography, and we wanted to see specifically how the topography, and when I talk about topography, we're talking about change in elevation here, and how that had changed after the Mesmery Realignment Scheme in 2013. Coincidentally, 2013 was also one of the years that we had a very large storm event. So this was a prime time for us to assess. You can also see on the screen, so the blue profile lines, the darker blue profile lines suggest accretional activity, and then you've got the red to suggest erosional activity, and then you've got the lighter blue and the grey suggesting little change. So the first highlighted area is the Mesmery Realignment scheme, which is just at the centre of the map and to the west of Selsey. And then you've also got to the east, you've got an area between Selsey and Pagham where we can also see very little change. And here we have post 2013. And again, the reason why we highlighted these areas is because we saw noticeable changes. They were natural and expected alterations from accretional to erosional changes to the elevation, suggesting erosional activity. And also, as expected, since this is plotted after a significant storm event and the realignment, erosional activity did occur. However, in the report, a more focused assessment on the elevation changes has been made, focusing on annual changes post 2013, looking at seasonal changes as well. So part of the first year study, we also looked at bathymetry data, and this was based on data availability as well. Bathymetric data produces information on subtidal changes in depth for up to 1 kilometre offshore. So a temporal assessment of these changes were made, mainly based on our data availability and the Chasm research areas of interest to us. So we use both multi-beam bathy data, which provides 100% coverage, and then we also use single beam bathy data, which provides more surveys and more availability. And this provided an assessment of a longer term scale. So the Mesmery site survey is located to the west of Selsey Bill Peninsula. As you can see, it's highlighted in the bluey, greeny, turquoisey colour. And then also to the west, we've got the west and east wintering zones. And these were both assessed for a period between 2004 and 2016. So you can see here, this is the Mesmery realignment site. So this is data from autumn 2004 until autumn 2018. And it is a similar range to the topographic data in that the red indicates, the blue indicates an increase in change in depth, and the red indicates a reduction in the change in depth. And as you can see, there is material loss at the site, which is as expected. So this was useful, however, to confirm our suspicions, and records and reports on Mesmery monitoring can be found on the Channel Coast Observatory website as well, looking further into it. But in terms of Chasm, this was a good insight to gain, even though it was expected, just to confirm our thoughts and our expectations. And so for the West Wintering site, as you can see here, we divided up the analysis from 2007 to 2018 on a biannual assessment. So the 9-year timescale between 2007 and 2018 shows that there is both a similar change in gradient colour, but also a spatial variability. And again, this is expected due to the association with the geomorphology of the site, such as the sandbars. So again, this is showing change that there isn't a lot of it, and it was expected from our suspicions and our understanding of the geomorphology, but it has still raised awareness and increased our understanding of the environmental changes in the area. And as this project is, the purpose of it is to research and use the data we have available to us. It has been very useful. So Chasm has been and continues to be a project that involves the mix of efforts and cooperation, including research and intern students like myself and Sherece. And we also had an undergraduate student do some turbidity analysis in both Mesmery and Pagham sites. So turbidity is the visibility of the water, and so I won't go into too much detail into this because it's not my research to credit. However, there is more in the first year report that I will mention on later as well. So this student analysed sediment rhythms in both Mesmery and Pagham, as you can see here, and on the bottom you can see the water depth, just to demonstrate how they've analysed this data. So the dark red stripes are the high tides, and the white stripes are the low tides, and the spikes will change over time. And the reason for this student analysing this data was to see if there was any impact from the NAB tower disposal sites on the turbidity of Mesmery and Pagam sites, and the data that they found showed no significant trends between these. But again, this was a useful insight to have for the project. Another environmental indicator which was assessed in the first year of study was sea surface temperature. So this figure shows the change to sea surface temperature at Bracklesham Bay wave buoy, derived from the Channel Coastal Observatory. The darker blue levels, or the lighter blue levels, are the cooler periods, and the warmer periods in July and August can be seen by the darker reds. So there's no obvious trend here, other than you can see over time as we move closer to 2019, the summers are getting warmer, but that is a well-known consequence of climate change. But this could occur at a more extreme result as time goes on. So this can be a concern because this can raise questions and need for further investigations into how this impacts the habitat and the potential migration of species in and around the Selsey Peninsula. And also in the report, there has been further assessment of monthly and seasonal, so you can look into that as well. So another environmental indicator was the storm and tidal conditions, but on this slide you can see the storm event frequency shown in a storm calendar. So the 2013, so this was both at Bracklesham Bay, Rustington and Hayling Island wave buoys, just to give us some spatial variation. So the 2013 and 14 storm season standard out to us in terms of number of events, but there have been other years that have also experienced a high number of storms. In particular, you can see at Hayling Island in 2016 and 2018, there were 7 storm events based on the mean wave height, which was recorded. So storm event intensity was assessed with the use of the wave height, as I've just mentioned. So as well as storm event frequency, we have storm wave height averages, which are also on a general increase as well, which you can also see in the first year report. Again, this is just recent change. This time series is not long enough to have any significant trends or analysis, but it does open up questions and allows us to understand the recent environmental changes more and potential indicators. So as I've been mentioning, there is a first year report with all this information that we've already provided and more. And the purpose of this report is to reflect the first stages of research, which were to create an evidence base of change to better understand how the Selsey fishing grounds are being impacted. Much of what we've covered today will be in it, but in a lot greater depth. And it is in its final editing stages. So please watch out and find a link on the webpage at the end to look out for this publish.
Which brings us to my part in Chasm. So as part of my time with Kent Wildlife Trust Consultancy Services, I was spending about 1 day a week over a 6-month-long period looking at mapping some of the Channel Coast Observatory's data. The overall aim was to create an interactive web-based map which displays spatial data through time. The kind of data I was interested in mapping was topography, bathymetry, wave, LiDAR, and results from the sediment analysis to see how they interact together. Ideally, it would have been great to have data mapped right back from in the 1940s to capture the change that the fishermen had experienced throughout their generations. Due to the time constraints, I have for now mapped data dating back to 2004, as this is what is readily available from the Channel Coast Observatory. This is the topography for 2004 to 2020, which, as you can see, has been mapped in ArcGIS. For those not familiar with what they're seeing, topography is essentially a measure of elevation, as Katie mentioned. So the deep purple on this map is the lowest point and the red is the highest. Where there is no colour on the map just means we don't have any recorded data for the area. So you may notice in some years looks a bit like this, with a mix of bathymetry from 2013 and 2016 on either side of the peninsula, and topography data for all years from 2004 to 2020. my next task is to get bathymetry data from a bigger range, so 2004 to 2020, in a time slider like the one you saw on the previous slide. And the progress of this project can be tracked through the webpage, which again will be linked at the end of this webinar. So that brings us on to the ongoing and future research of Chasm. So the project has a multitude of partners which will continue to assess the Channel Coast Observatory data. The analysis of particle size distribution at new underwater sites will also be continued, and there will be a continued integration of the measured data with the observed events and the timeline which you saw. We will also continue to deploy specialist equipment underwater in association with the Environment Agency, which gives measures of turbidity, oxygen, salinity, depth, and temperature. The chemical composition of sediment in Precaution Bay will be compared with samples from the NAB Tower, dumping ground, water samples from the freshwater sources entering from the harbours, and also samples from lobsters. In addition, there is the hope to enlarge the outreach of the Chasm programme as well. Lastly, we hope to map sediment plumes using satellite imagery, undertake coring of the seabed sediment to understand historical events, and undertake a chemical analysis of sediment samples. So the picture to the right illustrates the handheld X-ray fluorescence gun, which is what we may use to look for major elements, which tend to be over 1% of the rock, trace elements, which are below a few hundred parts per million, and they're things like heavy metals, which come from fuel oils or anti-fouling agents, and they can act as a signature for where the sediment may have come from. And lastly, the solid phase, which deals with the bioavailability of these chemicals in the sediment. We would look to use something like organic acids to extract hydrocarbons, for example. Hydrocarbons are naturally occurring in fossil fuels, but a high concentration will leave a trace, which we should be able to pick up. And with that, we'd like to thank you all for listening. And me and Katie are happy to take any questions now, but we realise we might not be able to answer all of them, so we can put any unanswered questions through to our Chasm partners and get answers back to you at a later stage.
Well, thank you, Katie and Sherece. That was a really, really fascinating presentation. And yeah, just I suppose goes to show how just doing some research really just ends up asking you more questions than it answers a lot of the time, doesn't it? So I think this is just going to be a really interesting project to keep going. It's going to keep evolving and keep unfolding. So we actually haven't had a huge amount of questions through tonight, which means we can get through all of those that have been asked. One person's asked about, well, I suppose this is actually like the $1 million question really, which is, can the sediment, does it contain any markers that make it traceable to its origin?
So, sorry, I cut out a bit then. What was the first bit of the question?
So it essentially just all of the sediment that you've been analysing, does it contain any markers that make it traceable to where it's come from?
As I understand it, I think they're like with what I was explaining in the last slide with sort of the heavy metals and things, it's an indication of where it could have come from. So if we know that there's dumping of material in that tower, for example, and if you know what kind of material has been dumped there, perhaps you can make the linkage. And also within the harbours as well, you might expect a bit more of those heavy metals or to be present. But to be completely honest with you, I think it would be better if we maybe direct that question to one of the partners who maybe be able to answer it a bit more concisely and has a bit more experience with it.
Oh, that's fine. I mean, yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because I think even if you could sort of, realistically trace these things, you could never do something like that with 100% certainty, could you? So great. And then we've had another question about the research itself and all of the various partners, which is who is actually funding the research?
Do you want me to take this one, Katie?
I don't mind, Sherece. I was just going to ask you. You can take it if you want. I'll take it. So currently there is no official funding. It's currently a reliance on the collaboration of partners and stakeholders. So however, we are looking into potential funding routes in order to secure either postdoc or doctoral researchers, which we would of course welcome with any financial backing. And again, myself and Sherece, we are intern researchers who have been helping as well. So I hope that answers the question.
That's brilliant. And then just one final question, which was, has there been much input from the local fishing community at all?
Yeah, the Selsey fishermen have been amazing. They were the ones that posed the initial question and the initial problems, and as a result they have been working with us, and as I said, some of those timeline changes in the timeline have actually come from talking with the fishermen and having interviews and chatting with them about what they've seen in the past and what they've seen through generations as well. And since then, many fishermen have given their time in obtaining data as well, so they've been really helpful.
We've actually just had a couple more questions just come in just as you were answering that last one. So I don't know if this is something that you'd really know the answer to, because obviously it was the Environment Agency that carried this work out. But why was the Mesmery realignment carried out if it was known that the resulting sediment could affect the fishing for crabs and lobsters and therefore the livelihood of the fishermen?
Yeah, I would say we personally probably couldn't answer that question, and it might be one we have to take away.
No problem. And then I've got more questions coming in, actually, goodness me. Is there any plans to evaluate the temporal variability because of the heavy rainfall events?
So as of yet, I can't answer wholly, but I can say that there have been recent publications of Mesmery changes, which means there is potential for it. But as of yet, there are no plans, but we're always open to it due to the data availability that we have.
Cool, right. We've got a couple more questions that have just come through, seeing as we're running, we've only been on the webinar just over half an hour. I think we've probably got time to just answer these last two. So we've had a question, loss of crab and lobster in the area could suggest that rocky habitat is being buried, but the bathymetry indicates that the Mesmery and the MCZ depth is increasing, so sediment being lost. So is the influx of fresh water affecting the salinity and driving crustaceans out? I suppose that's more of a kind of biological question, really, isn't it? Probably outside of what you've been researching.
Yeah. Oh no, you go, Sherece.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's definitely an interesting question, and I think it's something which is ongoing with the research that we're doing. So having sort of the specialist equipment that we've got out, which can measure salinity and turbidity, which may affect the lobsters and where they choose to settle, it definitely could, and that again is linked to the fresh water inputs, and hopefully that will become clearer when we start looking at satellite images as well, looking at sediment plumes, which is going to affect the turbidity again.
Interesting. We've got one final question here, which is about the fisheries again, and whether or not they had actually conducted any independent sort of analysis of this. I mean, I think probably the answer is what the fishing industry provide is more just what they're seeing on the ground, isn't it? But could the fish stocks be affected by anything in the sediment, or anything that's occurring totally separately? Again, I suppose more of a biological question for you guys. But
yeah, again, I probably wouldn't be able to answer the second part of that question, but that is again another question that we're trying to assess and figure out, really. And yeah, as you said, the fishermen have been helpful in terms of providing us what they've seen, but in terms of fish stocks or independent analysis, we haven't had anything from them, but we have the data that we have got, we have been trying to use. So.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's probably all we've got time for today. So if there are any other questions, as you can see, they've kindly put their email addresses here, so you can always get in touch directly. But otherwise, thank you ever so much, both of you, for joining us for the webinar tonight. I hope everybody's enjoyed it as much as I have. It's really, really fascinating project, and lots to watch out for in the near future with the report coming out, and hopefully more research to come.
Absolutely,
Thank
yes.
you, Sarah, yeah.
Thank you so much for having us.
No problem. Well, thanks again to all of you who attended. And like I said, the webinar will be recorded and uploaded to our website shortly. Okay, thanks very much, everyone.